Welcome to our class on the history of inmate rights, court cases, and constitutional foundations. Even the most chronic or hardened inmates have basic rights that are protected by the U.S. Constitution. If you are facing incarceration, or if you have a family member or friend who is in prison or jail, you should know about inmates' rights. Incarcerated individuals, whether pretrial detainees or convicted offenders, maintain certain rights throughout their incarceration. Scope. This course provides jail staff with a foundational understanding of the historical development of inmate rights in the United States. It explores key federal court decisions that have shaped modern correctional practices and outlines the constitutional amendments that form the legal basis for these rights. Emphasis is placed on understanding the legal precedents that guide day-to-day jail operations, including use of force, access to medical care, freedom of religion, and due process protections. The course also addresses the evolving standards of inmate treatment under the U.S. Constitution and their implications for correctional staff. But, before we start, I need to cover the terminal learning objectives and enabling learning objectives. Terminal Learning Objective, TLO. Upon completion of this course, the participant will be able to explain the historical development of inmate rights, identify significant federal court decisions impacting jail operations, and recognize the constitutional amendments that provide the foundation for those rights. Enabling Learning Objectives, ELOs. By the end of this course, participants will be able to 1. Define the historical context and evolution of inmate rights in the United States. 2. Identify and summarize at least 5 landmark federal court cases that significantly influenced inmate rights. G. Cooper v. Pate, Estelle v. Gamble, Turner v. Safley. 3. List 7 rights inmates retain while confined. 4. Explain the constitutional amendments most frequently cited in inmate rights cases, including the 1st, 4th, 5th, 8th, and 14th Amendments. The history of inmate rights in the United States has evolved significantly over the last century. Early in American corrections, inmates were considered civilly dead, meaning they lost virtually all their rights once incarcerated. Prisons operated with little oversight, and inmates had no legal way to challenge their conditions or treatment. The belief at the time was that punishment, not rehabilitation or fairness, was the goal of incarceration. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, prison conditions were often brutal, and courts largely followed a hands-off doctrine when it came to inmate complaints. This meant judges generally refused to interfere in how prisons operated. They believed corrections was a job best left to the executive branch and that judicial intervention would disrupt prison security and management. As a result, prison administrators had almost unchecked authority. That all began to change in the 1960s. The civil rights movement pushed the entire country to take a closer look at how people, regardless of race, status, or location, were treated by government institutions, including prisons. Courts began to realize that inmates still retained certain constitutional rights, and that the hands-off approach was allowing abuse and neglect to go unchallenged. This shift marked the beginning of a new era in corrections. One of the most significant legal changes came with Cooper v. Pate, 1964, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that inmates could sue state officials in federal court under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act. This decision gave inmates a path to challenge violations of their constitutional rights, such as religious discrimination or cruel treatment. From this point on, inmates could hold prison staff accountable through the legal system. Another key case was Wolf v. McDonnell, 1974, which dealt with inmates' right to due process. The Supreme Court ruled that inmates must receive basic legal protections when facing disciplinary actions, such as being given notice of charges and a fair hearing. This case helped establish that correctional facilities can't punish inmates arbitrarily and must follow certain procedures. In terms of medical care, Estelle v. Gamble, 1976, set an important precedent. The court ruled that deliberate indifference to an inmate's serious medical needs violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. This meant that jail and prison staff could no longer ignore or delay treatment for inmates without risking legal consequences. The courts have also addressed First Amendment issues. Inmates retain the right to practice their religion, as long as it doesn't interfere with prison operations. This was reinforced in cases like Olone vs. Estate of Shabazz, 1987, which allowed some restrictions but required that correctional officials show legitimate safety or operational concerns for limiting religious practices. Over time, Bell v. Wolfish pretrial, 1979, the courts clarified that while inmate rights exist, they can be limited if there's a valid correctional reason. For example, Turner v. Safley, 1987, established a test that allows prison policies to restrict inmate rights if the policy is reasonably related to legitimate penological interests. This means staff can limit rights for reasons like safety, order, and rehabilitation, but not just out of convenience or bias. Today, inmate rights are a balancing act between constitutional protections and the practical needs of managing a secure facility. Rights such as freedom from excessive force, access to legal resources, medical care, and religious freedom are legally protected. However, officers can and should set reasonable limits when necessary for security and discipline, as long as those limits are consistent and lawful. Understanding the history of inmate rights helps jail officers do their jobs more effectively and legally. It reminds us that respecting inmate rights isn't about giving up control. It's about maintaining professionalism, avoiding lawsuits, and upholding the values of justice that our system is built on. When we understand where these rights come from, we're better prepared to make good decisions and avoid costly mistakes. This completes the section on history and evolution of inmate rights. You can now move on to Part 2.